So there's a saying that goes, don't hate the player, hate the game. Essentially what that means is if there's a system in place where people happen to be taking advantage of that system, or not necessarily taking advantage, but they're maximizing their role in that system, then if you're mad at anything, don't be mad at the person taking advantage of the system, be mad at the system itself. And so that's generally my synopsis of the saying. And today that's what I'm doing here. I'm not mad, or I'm not calling out any specific player. Kudos to anybody who can make a better life for themselves. So respect there. What I do want to talk about is the transfer portal and how it has started a lot of conversations as it relates to March Madness. So it's the week of the Final Four. It's going to be taking place this weekend in San Antonio, Texas. And so I wanted to look at all four teams, which are all number one seeds, and look at their roster and sort of their depth chart and look at who are their starters. Where did those starters come from? Were they homegrown recruits that came up the ranks and just worked and the program built them and now they're a starter? Or have they come from other schools? So have they transferred? But not only have they transferred, but did they come from a Power 5 school? So one of the Big 5 conferences, Big 12, SEC, Big 10, ACC, Pac-12, folks like that. Or did they come from what they call a mid-major school, which is a much smaller school that doesn't get that national recognition? Because that's been the conversation, that the transfer portal is really ruining, the transfer portal in conjunction with NIL, I'm only discussing transfer portal here, but the transfer portal is really ruining these Cinderella stories and really going to be the downfall of these mid-major schools, because these kids, if they can transfer with no, consequences, negative consequences, and they could potentially through NIL get more money at these bigger schools with these bigger boosters or whoever, then who's going to want to go to a little school, especially if you are a top tier talent? So that's what I want to look at today. I've got all four teams pulled up here. I'm going to start with Houston, go to Duke, Auburn, and then Florida. And then I want you to make your decision for yourself. If you hate the transfer portal, maybe one of these teams you're going to be rooting for if none of your teams are playing. If you don't care about the transfer portal and it is what it is to you, maybe this doesn't mean anything to you. But I thought it would be interesting to look at the team starters. So let me qualify sort of the statistics here that I'm showing. I'm showing transfers from the previous year, not necessarily in their status as far as was it from a Power 5 school as it relates to the last school that they were at. So there's some in here that were at a mid-major and then they transferred to a different Power 5 school and then now they're at their current school. So that's why it would say yes on that Power 5 school, because the last school they transferred from was a Power 5 school. Now, reading some articles, some folks might attribute some of the stars to, or some of the starters to, coming from mid-major schools, but I don't want to do that because I feel like sports and high-performing athletes, it's a what have you done for me lately? So, 2 years ago, they could have been at a mid-major and then they transferred to a Power 5 school and not performed well, and then they wouldn't have got the opportunity to come to another school. So that's how I want to qualify some of those statistics or some of the data points that I called out here. But if we're just looking at Houston, so as you can see, I have all these statistics here. I really am not going to get into any of this. What I just wanted to get to are this Q column and this R column. And then I've got sort of summaries over here of what we're looking at. So as you can see, there's 5 starters here. And out of this, here's my transfer column. So let me just back up real quick. This is the Q column is going to signify if they transferred and if their transfer was from a Power 5 school or not. So if it's blank, that means they were not a transfer. And if it was yes, then that means they did come from a Power 5 school when they transferred. And if it's no, then they obviously came from one of these mid-major schools or a much smaller school. That's sort of the question I'm trying to answer is this really ruining that Cinderella story narrative that everybody's talking about? And even is it ruining mid-major schools' opportunities to get great talent? A lot of the times at this point now, this conversation with transfer portal and NIL working in tandem, where these kids can transfer at any time and there's no, like I said, consequence of you lose a year of eligibility or you have to wait a year or whatever. You can just transfer as soon as you don't like something or a better opportunity comes up, whatever that may be, just like you do in your career. You can move a job if you want, right? So I'm not faulting any player for doing that. If they get a good opportunity for themselves, why not take advantage of it? My question is this system the best for these types of Cinderella stories. And for the NCAA, is having Cinderella stories in March Madness even the goal? Or is it, hey, can we get all of these schools to watch us, the bigger schools, the Power 5 schools, their fan bases to watch March Madness in the tournament, and that's all we care about. It doesn't really matter about the little guy. I'm not saying that that's their intent. These are just questions you have to ask, or I've been asking myself as I sort of have looked into this information here. So that's the qualification, or the qualifiers for these columns and kind of what that is. So as you can see, 5 starters. This is the Houston Cougars, who come out of the Big 12. And so they've got their 5 starters here, and you can see right here they've got at least 3 transfers. So if, like I said, if it's blank, they weren't a transfer. So that's how that's going to be there. I won't explain that on each sheet. Obviously, I'm just going to look at these statistics over here, because these are sort of the summaries of what you're looking at over here. So as you can see, the number of total transfers that Houston had this coming into this year, the 2024-2025 season, was a total of 3. The total that came from mid-major was none. So if you hate this idea of the transfer portal and NIL, specifically the transfer portal, where kids can just move from these small schools to these big schools, then Houston's doing a good thing, right, in your mind, because they're not plucking from these mid-major schools, or at least they didn't last year. All 3 of their transfers came from a Power 5 conference, so 100% of those players. So here's a summary here. So Power 5 transfer is a starter. So obviously any of their starters or any of their transfers are Power 5 transfers, and so the percentage of those that are starters is 67%. So 2 of the 3 transfers are starters. So they're building their starting 5 from transfers, right? So these weren't necessarily homegrown kids that the system built, that their organization built. They were built and grown in other organizations or other teams, and then they moved to Houston, I assume, for a better opportunity to either start or play, or maybe NIL deals, whatever that might be. So obviously mid-major starters, there's none of those because they didn't have any. So the transfer is a starter. 2 of their transfers are starters, as we already said. So 67% of the transfers that they got in this past year happened to be starters. So that's 67% of their total transfers. And then I flipped that and said, how many starters are transfers? So out of 5, only 2 are, which is 40%. So of their starting 5, 40% of those are transfers. So, and Houston, like I said, all their transfers came from the Power 5 conferences. They did not pluck any from a mid-major school, at least last year. So let's move on over to the Duke Blue Devils. Let's look here. The number of transfers that they had this coming year was 5. And I actually am impressed with Duke because, in my honest opinion, I think they're just going to win it all, and it's not even going to be close, but that's just my opinion. But a lot of their guys, you can see one of their transfers is a starter, but they have a really young team, and so they're growing a lot. They have obviously had a pretty prominent basketball organization program for such a long time. So, kids probably still want the allure to be a Duke Blue Devils, probably still there to play basketball there. But yeah, so they've got a lot of young kids playing there, so I think that's great. So yeah, they had a total number of 5 transfers from this past year. The total number that came from a mid-major or smaller school is 2. So 40% of their 5 transfers came from these smaller schools. So if you don't love that, then maybe that's something to consider there. The number that came from a Power 5 was 3, so 60%. So the majority of their transfers actually came from Power 5 conferences. So they're not all of them, they were plucking from these smaller schools. So number of Power 5 transfers as a starter is 0%, which is interesting. So more of their starters was Power 5 conference transfer, but none of those are actually starters, at least from what I saw online. So moving on down to the mid-major transfers. So how many mid-majors are starters? So just one of their transfers, there was only 2 of them that came from a mid-major school, ended up being a starter. So that's 20% of the starting 5. So 20% of their starters are from a mid-major school last year. How many transfers total became starters? So just one, again, that same mid-major guy. And then how many starters are transfers? And so out of their starting 5, again, it's only going to be 1 of those are going to be a transfer from last year. So only 20% of their starting 5 is a transfer, and they came from a mid-major school. So like I said, a lot of these, and if I go deeper into these analytics here, there's 2 freshmen starting, 3 freshmen starting total, a transfer, senior transfer, and then a junior. So like I said, pretty young team, generally speaking. So yeah, that's the Duke Blue Devils. Going to the Auburn Tigers now. The total number of transfer they had was 7. So they were pretty active in the transfer portal, it looks like, relative to the other 2 teams we just looked at. How many of those came from a mid-major? school. 4 of those, which is 57% of their transfers, was from a mid-major school last year. How many of those came from Power 5? Obviously, it's going to be 3 now, so 43. So they had more coming from mid-major schools. So now, again, the question, if you don't like this, if you don't like these bigger schools plucking from these smaller schools, then maybe this isn't necessarily a team that you love going into the Final Four. If you obviously didn't go to school, if you're not a fan of them. I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm just saying that maybe that's something that you're considering. So how many Power 5 transfers is a starter? So one of the 3 that they had come from a Power 5 conference last year, another Power 5 conference school. Only one of those is a starter. And then mid-majors is a starter, 3 of their 4. So that's 75% of their mid-major transfers last year. This past year is a starter. So how many of their students that are mid-major transfers is a starter? So 3 of their starting 5 are mid-major transfers. So how many transfers are starters? They have 80% of their starting 5, which is 4 out of 5 of their starters are from transfers. And so you can look at this, and it's a pretty old team, not old, but it's a pretty experienced team. I'll say it that way, where a lot of these guys weren't necessarily homegrown at the Auburn program, but they were, like I said earlier, grown, developed, built at other programs, and then Auburn had the opportunity to get them in the transfer portal, and those guys saw it as a great opportunity. They moved to Auburn, and here you go. So yeah, Auburn's got a pretty mature team, but a lot of those guys did not, just looking at this, it didn't look like they were built in the Auburn program, but they worked well together this year coming from different schools, and yeah, so that's the Auburn Tigers there. So, and lastly, we're going to look at the Florida Gators. The total number of transfers they had was 6. How many of those came from a mid-major school was 5, 83%, and then only 1 came from a Power 5 conference when they transferred there. So only 17% of their 6 total transfers. So that 1 Power 5 transfer looks like he's a starter, and then 3 of the 5 transfers that they had ended up being a starter from mid-major schools last year. So the number of transfers that are starters is 4. And so that means, again, another 80% team where 4 of the 5 starting players on this team is a transfer. And if you look over here, 3 of these starters did not come from Power 5 conferences, and 1 did, and then 1 is a younger kid, a sophomore. So they're a little bit. They have 2 younger guys being sophomores, and then 3 seniors. Whereas the Auburn Tigers have all their 5 starters are seniors. So I'll be curious to know what next year looks like for them. That's kind of a summary of these 4 programs, and I'm curious from your perspective. Do you like the transfer portal? Do you think the transfer portal is the issue? Do you think NIL is the issue, or do you think both of them working together is causing these issues, or is this even an issue at all? Is it a place where you're just like, it is what it is, let these guys do what they want, I just want to see the best play against the best? I've heard that argument as well, so they don't mind any of this stuff happening. But I'd be curious to know what you think. Let me know in the comments below. If you like videos like this, I've been thinking about looking at really all 64 teams that were in the NCAA tournament this year, to kind of look at this sort of activity and what happened. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know and I'll do a video on something like that. If you like videos like this, maybe I'll do more. If not, I typically talk about project management, career development, growth, things like that. Follow me. My name is Ryan Holguin. This is a practical place where we like to say where project management meets real life. We will see you in the next video.